King Charles spent a short period of time in hospital today.
A phrase began moving through royal discussion with the weight of something far larger than ordinary speculation. The time has come. 4 simple words, yet in the world of monarchy, they suggest timing, duty, surrender, and the question no palace ever wants to face too soon. What happens when the future starts arriving before the present is ready to let go? Reports and royal commentary have placed King Charles III at the center of a deeply sensitive conversation, one that touches not only his reign, but the emotional future of the crown itself. The claim that abdication papers may have been signed has not been given the kind of public official confirmation that would turn it into constitutional fact, but the reason the discussion has become so powerful is because it reaches directly into the most fragile part of any monarchy, the moment when authority begins to shift from one generation to the next. For most families, a father stepping back would be private. It would be discussed in quiet rooms, carried through emotion, and understood only by those closest to him. But for the royal family, nothing about transition is ever only personal. A single phrase can become a national question. A document, even one only discussed in reports, can become a symbol. A pause in public life can become a theory. And when the name of Prince William, the Prince of Wales, enters that conversation, speculation stops feeling distant and begins to feel like the first outline of a new reign. That is what makes this moment so charged. Charles did not come to the throne as a young monarch with decades ahead of him to define the role slowly. He inherited the crown after a lifetime of waiting, after the long reign of Queen Elizabeth II had already shaped public expectations of what monarchy should feel like. His reign began not only with ceremony, but with comparison. Every step has carried the shadow of history, the burden of public adjustment, and the knowledge that his own son stands closer behind him than he once stood behind his mother. And that closeness matters. William is not simply the next name in the line of succession. He is the living image of what many people believe the monarchy may become: leaner, more modern, more family-centered, and more emotionally connected to the public mood. Yet that image creates a painful tension for Charles. A strong heir reassures the country, but he also reminds everyone that another chapter is waiting. A prepared son strengthens the monarchy, but he can also make the present reign feel more temporary than the palace would ever want to suggest. So when royal watchers hear language like "the time has come," they do not only hear one man considering his future. They hear the possible sound of the crown measuring its own stability. Was this phrase, if accurately reported, an expression of exhaustion, duty, private reflection, or institutional pressure? Was it about Charles himself, or about the monarchy looking ahead and quietly asking whether William's moment is closer than anyone expected? This is where Catherine, Princess of Wales, becomes essential to the emotional shape of the story. Her role may not be the legal center of succession, but it is increasingly central to how the public imagines the next era. Catherine represents calm beside pressure, family beside duty, and continuity that feels human rather than distant. If William is being watched as the future king, Catherine is being watched as the woman who may help make that future believable. That is a powerful position, but it is not a simple one. The closer William moves toward the throne in public imagination, the heavier Catherine's symbolic role becomes. She is no longer seen only as a supportive royal wife or a popular princess. She is increasingly interpreted as part of the monarchy's emotional insurance, the figure who could steady the next reign when public scrutiny grows sharper. And in a story shaped by abdication speculation, that kind of steadiness becomes more than admiration. It becomes strategy. But the same shift that strengthens William and Catherine's public standing could unsettle others around them. Queen Camilla's place in this discussion is especially delicate because her role is deeply tied to Charles's reign. She has lived through years of criticism, gradual acceptance, and careful public positioning to stand beside him as queen. If the conversation begins turning toward abdication, transition, or William's accelerated future, then Camilla is not merely watching a constitutional question unfold. She is watching the public story move toward a generation where her influence may naturally become smaller. That does not mean conflict has to be open. Royal change often happens through tone, emphasis, and attention before it happens through announcement. A name appears more often. A future couple receives more focus. A current figure becomes described as transitional. A public appearance is read not as ceremony, but as preparation. In monarchy, power does not always move with noise. Sometimes it moves through where people begin to look. And people are looking at William. They are looking at whether he appears ready without seeming impatient. They are looking at whether he can support Charles without being swallowed by the pressure of what comes next. They are looking at whether Catherine can continue to carry public trust without allowing expectation to harden around her. They are looking at whether Camilla can remain secure in the present while the country's emotional attention increasingly drifts toward the future. And they are looking at whether Charles himself is shaping a legacy that may be judged not only by how he reigns, but by how he prepares to hand forward the institution he waited so long to lead. That is why this reported moment feels larger than the claim attached to it. The monarchy has always depended on continuity, but modern continuity is no longer automatic. It must be shown. It must be felt. It must reassure a public that has become more questioning, more watchful, and less willing to accept inherited authority without emotional proof. In that environment, any suggestion of signed papers or private readiness becomes explosive because it gives form to a question already gathering quietly in the background. Is the next chapter being prepared faster than the public has been told? Princess and the Princess Royal also belongs naturally in this kind of discussion because she represents the harder edge of royal duty and has spent decades showing that service is not built on drama, but on endurance. If the monarchy ever faced a genuine transition crisis, royal observers would expect her to understand the difference between emotion and institutional necessity. She is the kind of figure who reminds the family that the crown cannot afford confusion, especially when the country is already watching for signs of weakness. And that is the first real layer of conflict. Not Charles against William, not Camilla against Catherine, not one dramatic confrontation at the center of the palace. The deeper conflict is between feeling and function. A king may feel the weight of his years, his reign, his health, his family, and his legacy. A son may feel the pain of being prepared to inherit while his father is still present. A wife may fear the shrinking of a role she fought hard to secure. A future queen may understand that every step closer to the throne takes something from private life. But the monarchy itself cannot be governed by feeling alone. It must protect rhythm. It must protect confidence. It must protect the image of certainty. That is why the words, "the time has come," carry such force, even before every detail is clear. They suggest not only a decision, but a reckoning. They raise the possibility that Charles may be facing the most difficult royal question of all, whether holding on protects the crown, or whether preparing to let go could become the final act of service. And once that question appears, everything changes. Because this is no longer just about one reported document, one phrase, or one wave of palace speculation. It is about whether the monarchy is entering a moment when the future can no longer remain politely in the distance, and whether William and Catherine are already being drawn toward a responsibility that may arrive before the family, the palace, or the public is fully prepared to name it. That quiet shift, if it is truly taking shape, would not begin with a balcony speech or a sudden public handover. It would begin in smaller ways: a change in tone, a heavier emphasis on William's duties, a sharper focus on Catherine's steadiness, and a growing sense that the monarchy is preparing the country emotionally before it ever explains anything formally. That is why the discussion around the reported papers feels more serious than ordinary palace speculation. It is not only the possibility of abdication that has unsettled royal watchers. It is the thought that planning may already be moving beneath the surface, not necessarily as a dramatic exit for Charles, but as a controlled effort to make sure the crown never appears uncertain. Monarchy survives by appearing continuous, even when the people inside it are facing some of the most painful decisions of their lives. For Charles, the hidden pressure is almost impossible to separate from the symbolism of his reign. He spent decades as the longest-serving heir in British history, shaped by waiting, preparation, frustration, and public judgment. To step back too soon, even in theory, could look to some like surrender. To stay too long under visible strain could invite a different kind of concern. That is the cruel balance facing any sovereign in a transitional age. The crown must look steady, but the man wearing it is still human. And that human side may be the reason the phrase, "the time has come," has landed so powerfully. According to royal commentators, the words suggest more than administrative planning. They suggest an emotional threshold the kind of private recognition that duty has entered a new stage. If accurate, it would not simply mean that Charles is considering what happens next. It would mean he understands the monarchy may one day require a decision that is painful precisely because it is loyal. But was this about Charles losing confidence in his own reign, or about the institution quietly protecting itself before doubt could spread? That question opens the deeper layer of the story, because the palace, as an institution, has always had to think beyond personal feeling. A monarch may experience grief, fatigue, pressure, or hesitation, but the crown cannot be seen to hesitate. If senior figures around Charles are discussing transition more seriously, as some observers have speculated, then their concern may not be emotion alone. It may be timing. It may be optics. It may be the fear that uncertainty, once visible, can travel faster than reassurance. This is where William's position becomes more difficult. The Prince of Wales may be the obvious future of the monarchy, but being obvious does not make the burden lighter. A future king must be ready without appearing to wait. He must accept preparation without seeming to push his father aside. Every additional responsibility can be read two ways: as support for Charles, or as evidence that power is already shifting. That is the narrow path William must walk, and it becomes even narrower when abdication language enters the public imagination. Catherine's role in that path is equally important, though more subtle. She does not need to speak about transition for her presence to matter. Her public composure has become part of the monarchy's reassurance system, the quiet counterweight to speculation, pressure, and family uncertainty. If William is being watched for authority, Catherine is being watched for calm. And in royal life, calm can become a form of power because it tells the public that whatever is happening behind closed doors, the future still has shape, discipline, and emotional control. That may be why some commentators believe the Waleses are now central to the monarchy's long-term survival plan. Not because they are replacing Charles in public, and not because the current reign is over, but because they offer the public something the institution cannot afford to lose: confidence in what comes next. Their family image, their restraint, their connection to younger generations, and their ability to appear steady under pressure all become assets in a moment when the crown may be thinking more carefully about continuity. Yet that creates tension around Camilla. Her place beside Charles is secure in the present, but any acceleration toward William's future naturally changes the emotional landscape around her. The Queen is tied to the King's reign, his journey, and the personal history that brought them both to this point. If the royal conversation begins to tilt toward transition, then her role is no longer judged only by present duty. It is quietly measured against a future in which Catherine may hold the public's emotional attention more strongly. That does not require open rivalry to become sensitive. In royal households, influence often changes before anyone admits it. A briefing shifts direction. A public event places one couple closer to the center. A commentator begins describing the future in warmer terms than the present. A photograph becomes a signal. A schedule becomes a message. None of these things alone proves a grand plan, but together they can create the feeling that history has started moving. And if history is moving, and would likely understand the danger of pretending it is not. The Princess Royal has lived through enough royal change to know that sentiment can soften a family, but confusion can weaken an institution. Her importance in this kind of moment would not come from drama. It would come from discipline, and represents the part of the monarchy that does not ask what is comfortable, but what is necessary. In any serious transition discussion, that kind of judgment becomes invaluable because it cuts through emotion without denying the cost. The larger implication is that the monarchy may now be managing two realities at once. Publicly, Charles must continue to look like a sovereign in control of his reign. Privately, if reports of deeper planning are accurate, the institution may be ensuring that William can step forward without panic, without uncertainty, and without the country feeling that change has arrived without warning. That is not necessarily abdication in motion. It may be something quieter, but almost as significant, preparation becoming more urgent. And preparation changes everyone. It changes Charles because every act of support given to William can feel like a reminder of what must eventually be handed on. It changes William because every new responsibility pulls him closer to a role that will define the rest of his life. It changes Catherine because her steadiness becomes less private, less optional, and more central to the monarchy's image. It changes Camilla because the future begins to cast a longer shadow across the present. And it changes the palace because once succession becomes part of daily calculation, even silence starts to feel deliberate. That is why the reported phrase has not faded quickly. "The time has come" sounds final, but its meaning may be more complicated than finality. It may not point only to one signature, one folder, or one decision. It may point to a growing recognition that the monarchy is entering a period where transition must be handled before it becomes visible, and where the next reign must be made believable before it officially begins. But the deeper question is not simply whether Charles is ready to let go, or whether William is ready to step forward. The more sensitive question is who inside the royal world would be most affected if the balance began to change, and whether everyone around the crown would accept that change with the same sense of duty. Because behind the visible discussion, another issue was beginning to emerge, not just the future of the throne, but the quiet power struggle that may shape how that future arrives. The quiet power struggle, if it was beginning at all, would not look like open confrontation. It would look like restraint. It would look like carefully controlled schedules, carefully chosen appearances, and carefully worded silence. Inside the royal world, power rarely announces itself with force. More often, it moves through timing, access, and the subtle question of whose judgment begins to matter most. That is why the speculation surrounding Charles has become so layered. The focus is not only on whether the king would ever step aside, or whether reports of signed papers reflect anything close to reality. The deeper issue is how quickly the royal household begins to behave, as though the next chapter must be prepared with greater urgency. Because once preparation becomes visible, even in small ways, it changes how everyone around the crown is understood. For William, that creates a difficult kind of authority. He does not need to ask for more influence for the public to begin placing it on him. He does not need to stand in front of his father for commentators to begin measuring his readiness. Every time he appears composed, every time he carries a major duty, every time he stands beside Catherine with calm control, the future seems less theoretical. And that is where the burden becomes dangerous. The stronger William looks, the more pressure gathers around Charles. No heir wants to become a reminder of his father's limits. Yet monarchy turns even love into symbolism. A son supporting a king can look like loyalty. The same son stepping forward too often can look like transition. That is the contradiction William must navigate. He has to reassure the country without making the present reign feel weakened. He has to prepare for the crown without appearing to reach for it. And if royal watchers are right that deeper transition planning is being discussed in private, then the Prince of Wales may already be living inside a future the public has only begun to imagine. Catherine's position sharpens that dynamic. She is not being watched only as William's wife. She is increasingly read as part of the next reign's emotional promise. In a monarchy where public trust can rise or fall through small gestures, Catherine's calm carries strategic value. She softens William's burden without diminishing his authority. She gives the future an image of steadiness that feels less distant than ceremony and less fragile than politics. That kind of public meaning can be powerful, but it can also make her every appearance feel heavier than before. And if the balance is shifting toward William and Catherine, then Camilla's place becomes more sensitive by the day. Not because her role disappears, and not because her position beside Charles is suddenly erased, but because public attention has its own momentum. The Queen's story is bound to the King's reign, to the years of judgment they endured together, and to the careful acceptance that eventually allowed her to stand beside him. But if the palace mood begins to turn toward transition, Camilla is forced into a difficult historical position, still central to the present, yet increasingly surrounded by conversation about what comes after. That is where emotional power and institutional power begin to separate. Camilla may hold the formal position now, but Catherine may hold more of the future's emotional imagination. Charles may still wear the crown, but William may increasingly carry the country's picture of continuity, and may not be part of the direct line, but her reputation for duty may give her influence at moments when the family needs discipline more than comfort. None of these shifts require a public argument. They simply require the monarchy to begin arranging itself around what it believes must survive. But was this truly about abdication, or was it about preventing the appearance of uncertainty before it could damage the crown? That question matters because royal history is filled with moments when the institution moved before the public fully understood why. The monarchy often reveals change through pattern before statement. A younger generation becomes more visible. A senior figure becomes more protected. A public message begins emphasizing continuity. A family member known for discipline appears more central. The machinery adjusts before the language catches up. And once the machinery adjusts, it becomes harder to pretend nothing is happening. According to some royal commentators, that may be the true significance of the current speculation. Not that one reported document alone has changed everything, but that the discussion has exposed how fragile the question of timing has become. Charles's reign has to appear strong, but it also has to prepare for a future that may be scrutinized more intensely than any previous royal transition. William's role has to grow, but not so quickly that it looks like the crown is drifting away from his father. Catherine's steadiness has to be used, but not consumed. Camilla's dignity has to be protected, even as the public looks ahead. This is the kind of pressure that can turn ordinary decisions into signals. A change in who attends a major event may be seen as preparation. A new responsibility for William may be interpreted as transfer. A quiet absence from Charles may feed concern. A supportive appearance from Catherine may be praised as reassurance. A disciplined comment from, and may be read as a warning. The monarchy may intend calm, but the public often reads movement. And movement is exactly what makes this moment feel consequential. If Charles is facing private reflection about the future, as some reports suggest, then the emotional question is not whether he values the crown. It may be that he values it too much to let uncertainty surround it. That is the painful possibility beneath the phrase, "The time has come." It does not have to mean surrender. It could mean recognition. It could mean that the king, after waiting a lifetime to reign, understands that history will judge him not only by how long he holds the crown, but by whether he protects the institution when the next chapter begins pressing close. For Anne, that would be the kind of truth she could understand without sentimentality. The Princess Royal has spent her life serving the monarchy as an institution, not as a stage for personal emotion. Her imagined role in moments like this is not to comfort the family and to delay, but to remind them that confusion at the top can become danger for everyone below it. If the crown must move, it must move clearly. If the future must be prepared, it must be prepared without mixed signals. And if William is becoming more central, the family cannot pretend that no one has noticed. Still, clarity does not make the human cost disappear. Charles would have to live with the knowledge that every step toward William is also a step away from the reign he waited so long to begin. William would have to carry the ache of being needed before he is ready to lose his father's full presence at the center. Catherine would have to accept that her calm may become a national expectation rather than a personal quality. Camilla would have to face the possibility that the future may narrow her influence before she has fully finished shaping her place in history. That is why the reported phrase has such force. It gathers every private fear into one public question. Who is ready? Who is resisting? Who is protecting the institution? And who understands that once the balance begins to shift, it cannot easily be moved back? But even that does not explain the most sensitive part of the situation. Because the real turning point may not be whether Charles has considered stepping aside or whether William is being prepared more urgently. It may be the moment when those around the crown realize that the future is no longer waiting quietly in the distance, and that one decision behind palace walls could force every hidden tension into the open. If one decision behind palace walls could force every hidden tension into the open, then the danger was never only the decision itself. It was the speed with which the people around the crown would have to adjust once the possibility became impossible to ignore. A monarchy can survive rumor when it remains outside the gates. It becomes far more difficult when the rumor begins to resemble preparation. That is why the atmosphere surrounding the reported abdication discussion feels so charged. The palace does not need to announce every internal calculation for royal observers to sense when pressure is rising. Sometimes the first sign of change is not a statement, but a shift in behavior. Who appears more often, whose duties seem heavier, whose silence becomes more studied, and whose role begins to feel less certain than it did before. If the speculation around Charles has done anything, it has made those details suddenly feel loaded with meaning. For Charles, the pressure would be unlike any other moment of his reign. The king is not simply a man being discussed by commentators. He is the sovereign whose personal strength, public rhythm, and sense of command shape how secure the monarchy appears. If reports suggesting deeper transition planning are accurate, then every movement around him becomes delicate. Too much visible support from William could raise questions. Too little could suggest the future is not ready. Too much explanation could feed the speculation. Too much silence could allow it to grow. That is the impossible royal balance. The crown must appear calm while preparing for uncertainty. It must show continuity without revealing fear. It must protect Charles's dignity while ensuring William is never caught unprepared. And the more intense the conversation becomes, the more every royal figure is forced into a role they may not have chosen, but cannot easily refuse. William's role becomes the most exposed. The Prince of Wales is expected to be ready, but not eager, visible, but not dominant, supportive, but not overshadowing. If the public begins to see him as the answer to uncertainty, that may strengthen the monarchy, but it also places a quiet strain on his relationship with his father's reign. A future king can become reassuring to the nation and painful to the present at the same time. That contradiction is where the emotional cost begins to show. William cannot step too far forward without seeming to pull history toward himself. Yet he cannot step back too much without allowing the country to wonder whether the next chapter has enough shape. If a transition is ever being considered more seriously behind closed doors, then the future monarch would already be living inside a rehearsal for power before anyone publicly names it as such. Catherine's presence becomes crucial in that rehearsal. She is not the one who inherits the throne, but she helps determine how the next reign feels to the public. Her steadiness gives William's authority a softer edge. Her composure helps transform pressure into reassurance. And if the monarchy is entering a more sensitive phase, the Princess of Wales may be asked, without a formal announcement, to carry more symbolic weight than ever before. That is where admiration becomes expectation. The public may praise Catherine for calm, but calm can become a duty. It can become something people demand from her in every appearance, every absence, every moment of strain. If William is being drawn closer to the center, then Catherine is drawn with him, not as decoration beside power, but as part of the emotional structure that makes that power acceptable. For Camilla, the consequences would feel different. Her public position remains attached to Charles's reign, but a stronger focus on William and Catherine naturally changes the atmosphere around her. It does not remove her from the present. It does not erase the journey that brought her to this place. But it does mean that any movement toward transition makes the future feel less like an eventual chapter and more like a presence already standing in the room. That is a painful kind of royal displacement because it rarely happens through one dramatic act. It happens through attention. The cameras linger elsewhere. Commentary warms around the next generation. Public sympathy begins attaching itself to what comes after. The present is still respected, but the future becomes emotionally brighter. And in monarchy, emotional brightness can quickly become influence. Princess, and would understand why that kind of ambiguity is dangerous. The Princess Royal has lived through the long discipline of royal service, and her public image is built on the idea that duty cannot be managed through sentiment alone. If the family is being pulled toward a more serious transition conversation, Anne's instinct would likely be toward clarity, not comfort. She knows that confusion at the top does not remain private. It travels through staff, schedules, public messaging, government expectation, and eventually national confidence. That is why one of the strongest turning points may not be a dramatic signature or a whispered phrase. It may be the moment when the palace begins acting as though the future must be protected more firmly than the present can comfortably admit. Once that happens, every choice becomes strategic. William's workload becomes a signal. Catherine's visibility becomes reassurance. Camilla's placement becomes a matter of sensitivity. Charles's public appearances become tests of confidence. And steadiness becomes part of the institutional shield. And from that point onward, the story moves beyond speculation into public meaning. Because the public does not need access to private rooms to form an interpretation. People read monarchy through images, timing, and tone. They notice whether Charles appears forceful or tired. They notice whether William seems burdened or prepared. They notice whether Catherine looks calm enough to steady a future reign. They notice whether Camilla appears central or increasingly framed by the shadow of what comes next. Even without official confirmation, perception begins to build its own version of events. Was this simply reaction to a dramatic claim, or was it part of a wider institutional calculation? That question is now difficult to avoid. If the monarchy ignores the speculation completely, it risks allowing others to define the narrative. If it pushes back too hard, it may make the issue feel more serious than it wants. If it leans into William and Catherine too visibly, it may make Charles's reign appear transitional. If it hides them too carefully, it may weaken the reassurance the public already seems to seek from them. Every option carries risk, and every risk touches the future image of the crown. Historical memory makes the pressure even sharper. Abdication is not an ordinary royal subject in Britain. It carries echoes of crisis, sacrifice, and constitutional unease. Even the mention of it awakens the idea that a monarch's private decision can become a national turning point. That does not mean current speculation should be treated as fact. But it does explain why the word itself changes the temperature of every discussion around Charles and William. The palace understands that better than anyone. It knows that once the public begins imagining a transfer of power, the institution must work harder to keep the present from looking fragile. It must hold Charles in dignity while making William look ready. It must allow Catherine's reassurance to be felt without turning her into a substitute center too soon. It must protect Camilla from being written out of the present while acknowledging that the public imagination is already moving toward the next reign. That is the real escalation. The monarchy is not only managing one reported development, it is managing the emotional consequences of people believing that change may be closer than they thought. And belief, once it settles into public conversation, can become almost as powerful as announcement. If reports of signed papers are exaggerated, the monarchy still faces the question they have raised. If the speculation fades, the pressure beneath it may remain. And if transition planning is quietly becoming more serious, then every person near the crown will have to decide whether to resist the shift, soften it, or help guide it before it becomes impossible to control. The most important consequence, then, is not whether one phrase has been repeated in royal circles. It is whether the phrase has exposed a reality already forming beneath the surface. Charles's reign may now be judged by how securely it prepares William's, and William's future may now be shaped by how carefully he steps forward without wounding the father he is destined to follow. And that is where the final question becomes impossible to ignore. If the monarchy is entering a moment where preparation and power are beginning to overlap, what does that reveal about Charles's legacy, William's burden, Catherine's role, Camilla's uncertainty, and the future of a crown that must look eternal while quietly preparing to change? If preparation and power are beginning to overlap, then the meaning of the moment becomes far greater than any single claim about papers, signatures, or one dramatic phrase. It becomes a test of how the monarchy handles transition before transition is official, and how a family built around duty survives the emotional strain of knowing that the future is already pressing against the present. For Charles, the deepest question is no longer simply whether he remains strong enough to reign. It is whether his reign will be remembered as a bridge, a pause, or a period of careful preparation for what comes next. That is a difficult place for any monarch to stand. He waited most of his life for the crown, but history may judge him not only by how he wore it, but by how wisely he protected it when the next generation began to move closer. If reports and royal commentary around the phrase, "the time has come," have revealed anything, it is that the public is no longer watching Charles alone. It is watching what Charles makes possible. That is where legacy becomes complicated. A monarch's legacy is not built only from speeches, ceremonies, and public duty. It is built from timing. It is built from judgment. It is built from the ability to understand when the institution needs steadiness more than pride. If the king is facing serious conversations about the future, then the emotional burden is enormous, because every step toward William also asks Charles to confront the limits of his own reign. Yet that confrontation, painful as it may be, could also become part of his final strength. Sometimes royal control is not shown by holding on forever. Sometimes it is shown by preparing the crown so carefully that the nation never feels it shaking. For William, the consequences are equally profound. The future monarch is not simply waiting for a title to arrive. He is being shaped by the pressure of expectation before the moment itself. Every sign of readiness becomes reassurance for the public, but also a reminder of the role that will one day separate him from ordinary family feeling forever. If people begin to look to him as the answer to uncertainty, then his burden grows long before any formal change takes place. He must become more visible, more decisive, and more royal, while still appearing loyal to the father whose reign he is destined to follow. That is the quiet ache inside succession. The heir does not only inherit authority, he inherits the emotional cost of becoming necessary. William cannot escape that. The more the public imagines him as the future, the more carefully he must carry himself in the present. He cannot allow ambition to touch the image of duty. He cannot allow grief to appear as hesitation. He cannot let preparation look like impatience. And if the monarchy is moving into a more serious phase of long-term planning, then his greatest test may be learning how to step forward without making Charles look as though he has stepped back. Catherine's role may prove just as important, though in a quieter way. Royal observers often focus on titles and constitutional order, but the modern monarchy also depends on emotional confidence. Catherine gives the future a human face. She represents calm under pressure, continuity through family, and the kind of visible steadiness that can make an uncertain public feel that the next chapter will not be chaotic. That does not mean her role is easy. In fact, it may mean the opposite. The more she is trusted, the more she is expected to absorb the atmosphere around her without disturbing it. That is why her position matters beyond popularity. Catherine is becoming part of the monarchy's emotional architecture. If William is the constitutional future, Catherine is part of the emotional reassurance that allows that future to feel safe. Her presence helps turn power into partnership. Her steadiness helps soften the sharpness of succession. And as the conversation around transition grows, she may become one of the figures royal watchers observe most closely, not because she announces change, but because she often reflects it before anyone says it aloud. For Camilla, the meaning is more delicate. Her role belongs firmly to Charles's reign, and that gives her dignity, history, and importance. But it also means that any movement toward the next era naturally changes the air around her. A future centered on William and Catherine does not need to reject Camilla in order to reduce her emotional influence. It simply moves the nation's attention elsewhere. That is one of the most painful truths of monarchy. Power can shift respectfully, even gently, and still leave someone feeling the ground has moved beneath them. Some will see the current discussion as unnecessary speculation, another wave of royal anxiety fed by dramatic language and public fascination with succession. Others will see it as a sign that the palace is being forced to manage a reality it cannot fully hide, that Charles's reign sits between the memory of Queen Elizabeth II and the anticipated future of William. Both interpretations matter, because monarchy lives not only through official facts, but through the feelings those facts create. Public perception is not the crown, but it can strengthen or weaken the crown in ways no document can fully control. That is why the question of abdication, even when unconfirmed, carries such unusual force. It is not only about whether a monarch leaves. It is about whether the public believes the institution knows how to move forward. It is about whether the present can prepare the future without appearing diminished. It is about whether a family can protect unity while quietly rearranging power. And it is about whether the next reign is being built with enough care to feel natural when history finally demands it. The long-term consequence may be a monarchy more conscious than ever of timing. Royal observers will be watching whether William receives greater responsibility, whether Catherine's public role continues to deepen, whether and appears more often as a figure of disciplined continuity, and whether Camilla's place is framed with the careful dignity of a present role that history may soon begin measuring differently. These signs may not confirm anything dramatic on their own, but together they can reveal the direction of travel. In royal life, the pattern often speaks before the announcement, and perhaps that is the real transformation unfolding behind palace walls. Not a sudden collapse, not a simple handover, not a single document changing everything in one stroke, but a slow reordering of expectation. Charles remains central to the present. William is becoming harder to separate from the future. Catherine is becoming more essential to the emotional image of that future. Camilla is navigating the painful space between loyalty to the current reign and the reality of what comes after. And the institution itself is trying to make all of that look seamless, because seamlessness is one of monarchy's oldest survival tools. The phrase, "the time has come," may never mean only one thing. It may be read as duty, fatigue, courage, strategy, or speculation. But its power lies in the question it leaves behind. When does a monarch know that preparation has become more important than delay? When does an heir stop being a distant promise and become the quiet center of national reassurance? And when does a family decide that the future of the crown must be protected even if the emotional cost is felt behind closed doors? So what do you think? Was this simply one royal development shaped by reports and speculation, or does it point to a much larger shift inside the monarchy? Is Charles's greatest legacy still being written through his reign, or through the way he prepares William and Catherine for what comes next? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep royal analysis, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary-style royal story. Because in the end, the future of the monarchy may not arrive with one announcement, one signature, or one perfect moment, but through the quiet realization that history has already begun moving toward the people who must carry the crown next.